Zach back here from Universal Air, and today we're going to show how to fix your CVT issues where your compressor dies. In this video today, we're going to be taking apart the Accuair CVT tank and removing their compressor to convert it down to a VT, and we can hook up some external compressors so that way we have the reliability of the Viairs, not have to deal with the CVT issues no more. So what our game plan here is, we're going to remove the CVT, take off the end caps, pull out the compressor, and then we'll end up hooking up some external compressors up above here. That way we can fill up the tank. All right, now to get into this tank, we're going to loosen off on all these bolts around the perimeter of it, along with the bolts on the other side. And then we can add a little bit of air in through the exhaust port of the tank, and that'll actually push the caps out. Now we're only going to want to thread this out part way. That way when we go to push it out, we don't actually shoot it out of the tank and hurt ourselves. Now a little tip for you guys, if you can't get this thing to lift up, if you actually feed air in through the exhaust port, what it'll do is it'll go backwards through the valves inside the tank. It'll fill up your bags along with filling up the tank itself. So when you're stuck on the road, or in his case, you're stuck on the trailer, I added air through the exhaust port of the tank, and that in turn filled up all of the bags on this side. And then we did the same thing over here on this side where we fed these valves exhaust ports, and it made it to where he's able to lift the car up and we can get it up off of the trailer. What we're gonna do here is start by loosening this off. Just quarter, one, quarter, one, quarter, half, quarter, two. So we can go around and loosen this off 2 full turns. Half, one, half, two. Go ahead and do this on both sides. Alrighty, what our goal here is, we want to put some air here in one of the bag lines. What this is going to do is allow us to press the caps out using air pressure. All right, if we watch right here on this seam, as we add some air pressure, it's going to start to press the cap out. So I pressed it out a little bit on this side, along with a little bit on this side. We do have this drain unit right here that we can use to relieve in the air that's inside the tank. We want to be careful because we are pressurizing air inside of this tank as we're moving this out. So what we're going to do is we're going to slowly walk it out little by little on both sides. And as we hit the bolts, we can loosen the bolts up a little bit to pull the cap further out until the seal reaches the edge at which it's going to no longer hold any air pressure. But ideally, we want both of these sides to have a good lip on there so we can easily pull the cap out. If you go ahead and look here, you can start to see how we got a little bit of the black O-ring starting to come out of the seam. And same thing over on this side, we got the O-ring starting to come to the edge. This is about as far as you're gonna want to take it. You can push it out a little bit more, but be careful because once that O-ring does come out, it will end up blowing out all the air that's inside the tank. As I keep adding more air inside the tank, walking it out, I'm going to check this relief valve or the water drain valve to make sure we don't build too much pressure inside the tank and have it come off at like 150 PSI, basically as much as our shop air is pumping into it. So we're going to keep working this out to get this cap safely out. And of course, it should go without saying, you should be wearing safety glasses. We are dealing with pressurized air here. Alrighty, this is about as far as we can get it. You can see the black O-ring is at the lip of the end of the tank. This is kind of ideal. The way I like to do it is where we have about equal space on either side. That way we can get in there with a plastic tool to finish working it out. Once you get one end cap off, you can actually go through and poke out the other side, but we do have the compressor in the middle on this one, so we're gonna have to see how we're gonna do that one. We've gone ahead and removed the rest of the bolts, the rest of the way off of here. What's nice is we use the air to push the cap out to where we start to see the black seal. Now it's literally just comes right off. Now one thing that does stand out to me is it is awfully dirty inside that tank. Got a little bit of corrosion on our valves. I'm assuming the customer didn't drain his tank that often. It was supposed to be a completely dry system, but they did end up changing that fairly early to where they were damaging compressors from regenerating their desk kit too often. So now what the game plan is is on a typical VT tank, here's your valves, and this plug right here is actually the plug that goes onto your end cap over here. So what we need to do is we need to remove this unit here and move this plug over to this side so we can get direct access to the valves. And over here on this side, we end up having to do the same thing where we remove this plug, put that plug over here where the red plug is at, and we'll go ahead and remove this purging solenoid off of the tank as well. So the first thing we're gonna do is start taking off this plug. Oh great, we're not spinning. Now the issue I was having is this nut inside here is just spinning, so it can't actually get to loosen off. Looking at this part, we can tell that Accuair spent a lot of time trying to design this. Well, it's too sad, but too bad we have to go through all this to take it out. So we have our plug bracket removed that held this plug inside the tank. Next, we're going to disconnect these two air lines. There's one right there, one over here. And then right down inside here, there's a clip that holds this plug into the cap. That's what we're gonna do next to get this whole end cap off the tank. And of course, you wanna be wearing safety glasses here because these things always tend to fly right into your eyeballs. And this little line. This valve right here is supposed to just thread in. This was that purge valve. Right down inside there, looks like there's a set screw. We're gonna try to get that off. And now that we finally found an Allen wrench that'll fit it, let's go ahead and loosen it off. I think the best bit of advice I have for anybody trying to do this is just go down and buy a brand new set of Allen wrenches. Never fails, you're gonna be missing the one that you need and spend half an hour looking for it. There we go. Yeah, we got our end cap free. So now when you take off this NPT, it should be threaded in from the front side, so we should tighten this into it. All right, here's our other cap. Let's get started by taking the plug off. Works a lot better when the nut's not spinning. Here's our plug. Now the clip, here's not losing an eyeball. Pull out our plug. That end cap is free. All right, hopefully you guys can see down inside here. What we're trying to do is there's the little bolts that hold the compressor into these rails. You can see them right down there. We should be loosening those off with a long extension coming out here. And then once we get both sides, there's a little plug on the side that we're going to remove to pull this whole unit out. Looks like Accuair was nice enough to pre-strip a few of these bolts for us. So we're gonna have to try to get a real long, deep, skinny socket to get down there straight onto it, opposed to the swivel head that they provide with their tanks for the mounting bracket. One thing I find very interesting on it, if you look at the screw, it is a tapered screw. That means as you tighten it up in there, it's gonna wedge it out further and further. But if we can't get it loose, it's not gonna help us. All right, to any of the former Accuair engineers, I'm gonna apologize now, but this is what I did. You got a driver to your socket and a 1/4-inch socket. That way we can fit it down in between these thin rails. That way we can get in there and loosen them off, going straight onto it. All right, let's try the other one. All right, got all the wedge screws out. Now we need to work on getting these two plugs out. That's the one we're looking for. It has the extra boss that held the pump in. So this will be a regular plug. Now, with fingers crossed, we can pull this pump out. Oh, here it comes. Ooh, it smells burnt. There's our compressor. Now, to help show you guys what we're trying to take out is those tapered screws go inside these little units here that will squeeze against the tank to hold the compressor in place. So there was 3 of them on this side, and then on this other side there was 1 there and 2 there. So they had 3 on each side holding the compressor. Just looking at it, I can't really see anything physically wrong with it, but it definitely does smell like burnt electronics. I'm gonna talk with the customer to see if we can try and get inside here in the potted unit to see if we can physically see what's wrong with it. But of course, Accuair style, they did fully pot the unit in there. Now with everything disassembled, we're gonna go ahead and the new O-ring onto the old VT plug that was inside the tank. You wanna make sure you put a little bit of grease around the O-ring to lubricate it as it goes in. And if you look, you see we got this little flat side. We got the little flat cutout in there. Let's go ahead and try to get this in. I'm not really liking how this is getting pulled. So we're going to reclock these coils. So in order to reclock these coils, we need to loosen these, take the nuts off the top. Now you want to be careful that you don't mix these up, because then that means you'll no longer be able to have them correspond to the right switch, or in this case, have the E-level actuate the right valve. It's very disappointing to see this much corrosion on all the hardware, but it is what it is. We'll go ahead and clock that inboard. Tighten this back up. I'd recommend only do them one at a time. That way you don't mix up any of the valves. Now, like any solenoid valves, you want this snug but not so tight you're going to break it. Now let's see if we can fit it in there. Like any O-ring, should be able to push it straight down. Still got a little ways to go. Man, that's a nice way to break some wires. There we go. Snap down. Then we take one of our eye-losing clips, get it over it. Okay, I find the easiest way to work with these is to start this end first, the squared off end, and use this side with the relief on it as the side you can push into the last bit. You push that clip down into the groove, kind of work it around, and there, make sure it snaps inside that groove. It should look something like that. Now this cap is ready to go. This is our safety relief valve. We do want to leave that just in case our tank was to get up to such high pressure. All right, now let's go ahead and move on to the other side. We do need to remove that plug still. I did take the liberty of loosening it up, but just remember it is reverse threaded, so we tighten in from the back side to thread it out of the end cap. You can see it's coming out right there. So this was our compressor inlet filter port, which we're no longer using. We're gonna have another 1/2" MVT plug we're gonna have to plug up. So on this one, now we're gonna do the same thing, move it around. So let's start off by loosening that. One thing to note on these is that this bottom piece does key into the actual coil cover. The key's in there, so you wanna make sure those pieces are aligned when you're tightening it down. So I just run the wire in between there, so now it gives us slack to get this plug into this original VT location. Like I said before, it's snug, but not so tight you're gonna break it. And we need to put an O-ring on this piece. So we wanna put it on there and then slowly work it around. Make sure you're not twisted. Should be able to move freely. Then like before, we're gonna take a little bit of grease, put it around the O-ring, and that'll help it slide into this pocket a little bit better. Line up our keyways. It does take some force to push it in there. Now it's time for the clips. This clip will slide in over that again. So get that bottom hook. There we go. So now this cap is ready to go. We do want to replace these O-rings whenever you take them apart. Pull off the O-ring, put in the new one. And of course, we're gonna have replacement O-ring kits for these things. The bolts, you definitely have to replace the O-rings. Technically, we're supposed to replace the bolts themselves, but unfortunately, it's some magic herb and spice bolt that we don't know what it's supposed to be. So we're no longer gonna have our 1400 PSI burst rating. I don't personally know what it is because I can't test high enough to make this thing fail. Just know that you are supposed to change the bolts, but we don't know what bolts are supposed to be. So I'm gonna go ahead and lube up this O-ring. We're gonna go ahead and put it back together. I'm gonna replace out this one. Now that cap's ready to go in. All right, it's now time to put it in. The end caps, we have the legs pointing downwards so that we can make sure it stays straight. And if we look on here, we want to make sure the cap's in the right orientation. We've gone ahead and lubricated up the O-ring so it should slide in there smoothly. Now me personally, I'm a fan of slowly walking it in. I have not put on the replacement O-rings on here yet, simply because we will be tightening this thing as we walk it in. So if we line up our cap, get our bolts started, put in a couple of them. So with it like this, we have 3 bolts started. It's still loose, the O-ring is just getting ready to start press in. What we're gonna do is we're gonna slowly work around it, tightening it up to make sure to push that cap in straight. Last thing we wanna do is to catch this O-ring on this tube and have it rip the O-ring and cause a leak right there. So as we run this in, we can watch the O-ring, and as soon as the O-ring gets to the cap, I stop there. Okay, everything's ran in finger tight. So now we're gonna start going around it little by little. You can see as we walk it in there, it's going in fairly straight. And we haven't caught our seal. Everything's pushed in. Now we'll go ahead and start the other side. Alrighty, with our 3 bolts ran in, we're gonna go ahead and start putting O-rings onto these bolts. These are the original bolts. Like I said before, we are supposed to replace these bolts. Now when you're putting this on there, you wanna be careful you don't rip the O-ring. This really isn't the best design for an O-ring to be over a thread. You want to try to avoid stretching it out as much as possible. You want to make sure you get it all the way up there. They have a little relief machined on it. We're going to go ahead and put on all of our O-rings. All right, we got all the O-rings put onto the bolts. It's got to be one of the most tedious parts of this entire job. We do still have our 3 bolts in there. What we're going to do is we're going to put in and torque down the rest of the bolts, and then we're going to remove those 3 bolts and put in fresh O-rings. Now, I definitely recommend to put a little grease on the O-ring itself, so when you tighten it up inside that face down inside there, you don't rip it more than it's supposed to be. These O-rings are a single time use. As soon as you torque them down, you will destroy the O-ring. If you go to back it out, it's going to leak. Now, the proper torque spec for this tank is 200 inch-pounds or 1.67 foot-pounds. So what we want to do is put a little bit of grease on the O-ring itself. We can thread them in. Now, I definitely recommend against the urge of trying to grab the impact and tightening it up, because the 16 foot-pounds really isn't that much torque. So I run these in by hand, or I should say lightly with the wrench. And then I'll go ahead and torque down those 2 and remove that one so I don't forget which ones still had the original O-rings on them. And then this is our other one that's still the original, so we'll go ahead and run this one in. And you can see here what happens with the O-rings when they actually torque them down. It does deform it. Make sure to get all the O-ring debris out of there, if there is any. All right, now that we got the end caps pressed back in, there's a couple holes we have to deal with. We have the 1/4-inch NPT ports. One of them was the pin that held the compressor. The other one was plugged that we removed to pull out the pump. And then also we have a 1/2-inch NPT port up here that held the compressor inlet filter. What we're going to do is we're going to use a thread reducer and put the new tank pressure sensor up here, because we're doing external with a regular E-level. And then we're going to run our line in from our compressors to this one, and we're going to go ahead and plug the other 1/4-inch NPT port. All right, we want to go ahead and pressurize the tank and check for any leaks. So we're going to fill it up with some air. We're going to go in through the compressor inlet port. Then we go ahead and spray everything down. We want to make sure we check all of our bolts. Check our plug around the perimeter. We'll go ahead and come over on this side. Our 1/4-inch plug and our air fitting. Now, we got another one right there. That one taken care of. That little one right there. And then that one right there. And we should be good. Here's a little tip for you guys. Generally, I prefer to use a Loctite 545 because it's just a lot easier to work with. However, I find sometimes these tanks are a little hard to get to seal up. We did do a video on fittings, which you can click over here to see. But I find if you have a tank that's giving you a hard time to seal, if you take your fitting, wrap it with Teflon, just make sure that you don't get the Teflon over the edge of the fitting. Then you can actually take that with a little bit of your liquid. In this case, it's a Permatex version of the 4.5 from Loctite. I recommend against using the 5.65 because I find if you ever have to take them out, it's very hard to get the fittings back out. So with that, it's Teflon with a little bit of liquid sealant over it. I find this will make even the most troublesome tanks seal up real easily. All right, so we got our 1/4-inch NPT plug sealed up with some Teflon and the liquid. I'm gonna go ahead and thread that in. Make sure whenever using the regular Teflon, you don't ever turn it backwards, because it'll never seal back up when you unravel the thread out of there. We're gonna do the same thing on our little 1/8-inch plugs. Looks like they put on some of the liquid sealant, which I prefer the white stuff, or the pipe dope. I prefer not to use that stuff because I find that it'll start seeping its way through the port over time, which that's exactly what this thing looked like. Regular old Teflon is a pain to work with because you do have to wrap it, but it tends to never start leaking over time. So I just take the fitting, put it on the wrench, take the tape, put it over the top of it. Make sure that you don't go to the bottom side of the fitting. It's okay if it hangs over the top, we'll clean that up afterwards. You get your one good wrap on there. Usually do 2 to 3 full wraps of the regular blue Teflon. And when it's hanging over the edge like that, it's nice because you don't drop them as easily. Put a little liquid over it. You guys might say this is overkill, but I find I'd rather go overkill and not have to come back and take it back out because it's leaking. It just comes right off. It's a little bit of booger that's left there on the port. Just take a rag, wipe it up. It'll give you a nice clean look. All right, we got some air hooked up to it. Go ahead and spray it down again. One good one. Two good ones. 3 for 3. Looks like it. Go ahead and double check everything again. I was worried about these ports. It's just weird the way that the soap just kind of runs off the edge. Makes you think it's leaking. And I find sometimes it's hard to find the real slow leaking fittings. So if you soak it down, give it a minute, so that way you can see any like foam left over from it. Makes it easier to find them. I'd rather spray it down 10 times here on the bench than get it in the car and have to rip everything apart after we're done. I think we're good. No foam on our seams. That little bit, you see how the bubbles are sitting there, but they're not growing or moving. That generally means it's just sitting on the threads. You wipe them down, you come back a few minutes later and you see some like foam looking on it, then you know for sure you got a real tiny, tiny leak. For this one, it's time to now get the compressors mounted into the car so we can run it over here since we don't have the pump inside no more. All right, now it's time to clean up the wire. This is a blue plug that used to go into the CVT tank along with the red plug. I'm going to go ahead and pull that wiring out along with get it prepped to run the regular pressure sensor on the E-level. All right, now we need to repin this main harness. Easiest way I find to take them apart is take a pick and you reach in here on the sides and you pry up a little bit on both sides. There's a little clip on the side of it, which I'll pull out and show. So go ahead and bring this all the way out. And what we're trying to get to clip off is these little ones right here. Now we will need to repin in a pressure sensor harness, which this one right here unfortunately has a yellow wire instead of a green wire, but it's all we could get. If you still have your original Accuair harness, I'd plug that back in, as well as we need an ignition wire for our compressors now to turn on. So what we want to do is the yellow wire for the compressor turn on that goes to the C adapter, which is down below. We're going to go ahead and remove that one. You pick up on the little pin and you push it out. And we can go ahead and plug in this harness right here. We also need to remove the green wire which goes to the C adapter. And then we plug in our yellow wire off of this harness, which unfortunately doesn't match. And then we also need to plug in the red and black wire, which we'll go ahead and put up on the screen where they're supposed to go. But the black wire is supposed to go to pin 13, which is right next to the yellow compressor wire, which is basically between the yellow and the orange wire. We pull out those stops in this one. And then our red wire goes to pin number 6, which is next to the, or in this case it's now yellow, but it was the green for the signal back from the tank pressure sensor. You generally just want to make sure all your pins are straight before you button this thing back up. So if you're looking at this right here is the clip that holds it in. And then your wires in here, you're going to have this one right here, which is in the far corner, is the red wire. That's the power for the ECU. This next one over is the orange wire. That's your ignition for the ECU. And then this one right here is one of the ones we just put back in. That's the black for the tank sensor. And then this yellow wire right here is going to be the yellow wire for the compressor turn-on signal. And then up here on the top side, the first one would be the purple wire if you had hooked up to your headlights to automatically dim. This one is the green wire that goes to the tank sensor, which in my harness I have here is yellow. And then this next one over is the red, which is the power for the tank sensor. And then finally out here in this far corner is the black one, which is the ground for the ECU. You want to make sure that all the thicker part of the sensor, the thicker part of the wire terminals are towards the plastic on either side. Get them as straight as you can. Then this part just goes in there, little fingers slide in between every connector to keep each one isolated, and it just clips in. And now all of our wires are terminated and everything's secured. And now would be a good time to take this little piece of shrink wrap, push it up, and go ahead and shrink it down. With that disconnected, it's time to remove the C adapter now. And this right here will no longer be used. And there's the wires we pulled out of the main harness going to the E-level. right, a couple things we're trying to do here. I wanted to lay down this compressor because we have the roll cage that goes across here. And this way we can slip it in there without having to mount the pumps on inside the car. In order to do that, we're removing the 3 bolts off the front, the 2 that held the leg on, and then there's 1 up here that we're gonna be putting the leg over to. Something that's worth noting is that the bolts themselves are different lengths. So the longer bolt goes with the leg and the shorter bolt doesn't. And then if you look on here, we line up that back hole, no problem, but that front hole is hitting on the bottom. So we have to take it over to the belt sander and grind a little bit off of this corner. Give you the quick rundown of what we did. To line up the holes with the bolts for the compressors, I find a typical outdoor screw as a very sharp point. So I went through and I marked all the points on the board that we had. It's already been covered in leather. From there, we drilled through the board so we have room for our screws to come through. Over on this side, we went ahead and counterbored with a Forstner bit in order to get the clearance for the screw heads and to get the bolts to the right length. From there, my secret to keeping these things tight is to use good old Loctite. I prefer to use the blue, that way you can get them apart if you ever need to. You can use red if you want to cut them off. Then also continue to use the serrated washers and lock washers that come with the Viair units. Now when it comes to compressors, there's a few things that I like to do. Biggest is when it comes with this factory little warning tag on the top, I prefer to cut that off. If you do it before you run the compressor, they come off fairly clean. If you run them, you tend to melt them a little bit and it gets really hard to try to get it off of the end of the compressor head. On the air filter itself, I prefer to take off the little plastic bracket that comes with it. This little one, I think it just looks a lot cleaner when you have just the filter by itself. Same thing goes for the little warning sticker that's on the front of the pump. I take those off. I don't want to see a little bit of white down inside there, especially on these black compressors. This cover, you can remove it and put it on whatever way you want. That way you get your logos going the right way. And then same thing on this side, flip them the other way. On the end of the leader hose, I prefer to take off the stickers as well. This one did pull a little bit of the plating off with it. So when we install them, we'll try to get that to a part that wouldn't be seen. For the wiring, I prefer this type of loom over them. I think it makes it look a lot cleaner, even though all this back here you won't see, but I prefer to make everything as clean as possible. I did measure between my ends to make sure my pumps are centered across the back. And now we can go ahead and slip this in underneath that roll bar and then get the tank put back in the front and start plumbing everything up. Alrighty, we went ahead and got the compressor board put in here. We ran our 2 hoses together and we're gonna tee them and run a single line up to the tank. That way everything will be hidden underneath here. And we've also wired up our 80 amp solenoid. This is what's gonna be turning the compressors on and off. We ran the power and ground wires over to the solenoid to power it, as well as we tapped into the ECU underneath here for the accessory, turn on the accessory pin. And then also we hooked up the tank sensor harness, which comes up over here. That's gonna plug into the end caps to be able to open and close the valves. So now the only thing left to do is get the tank back in here, get it wrapped up. All right, everything's all wrapped up. Got everything plugged in and wired in on the end caps. You take a close look up there, you can kind of somewhat see the 485 blacks. And here on the end cap is our pressure switch and our valve wiring. There's the compressors on. I'm not sure if you can actually hear them running. It does have a little bit of a hum if you pay close attention, but this exhaust is so much louder, we can even tell the pumps are running from this far away. But on the inside, we can actually somewhat barely hear it. It is open hatch design, so the pumps literally are right behind us. Thankfully, this car is so loud, if we didn't know that was the compressors, it'd be hard to tell if that's what it was or not. The valves are all working now. The right corner is moving. Go ahead and hit our presets now and it'll start working again, which with the CVT not working, the presets were gone, so it stopped working. And like that, we're all done. We went ahead and removed the compressor out of the Accuair CVT, converted the tank from a CVT to a VT, so we had the valves still working inside there, and hook up a pair of external Viair compressors. Now the car is back up and running, gonna have many years of good service with it. If you guys like this video, please hit the like button. Any questions or comments, please leave them down below, and we will see you on the next one.